Hello, my name is Bethany, and today I want to talk about the Boston Massacre. It happened on March 5th, 1777. It was a culmination of two separate parties, one a frightened regiment and another a frightened mob angry with the British laws that were being forced upon them. I feel that this is an important subject to discuss because I find it interesting that it was John Adams, the lawyer and future president, who decided to defend the soldiers who had gunned down 5 men of the mob. And I also find it interesting that it wasn't just soldiers shooting into a crowd, but it was a culmination of the crowd throwing and shouting and the confusion that happened that created this incident. And this ended up in the death of 5 men and several others injured. I happened to find the notes actually taken for the trial, and it was actually really well laid out. It gave word for word testimony, and I think this would be important for a history class to see how the trials were done back in that time, to see what was said and see how they were defended. Now, this was over 200 pages, so it would be cruel to make the students actually read every single thing, but to go through the highlights of the trial, to see how John Adams defended the soldiers and to see what came about, I think would be very important. So to have the students look at how each man would reply to the questions that was asked, how the testimonies came out, and to see how John Adams worked his way to get most of the men off, and only 2 of the men had to only 2 of the men were convicted of manslaughter but not murder. And because they were first-time offenders, what they had was to have their thumbs branded, literally branded, with iron and fire, and they were marked with an M to show that this was their first offense, and because they were branded, if it was to happen again, they would have to have the death penalty. Which is another reason why John Adams was so adamant about defending them. And I found this out in a book written 100 years later that talked about the reasonings behind John Adams. And the title is really long, and the book is called History of the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, and and it says consistency of the narrative of the town, the trial of the soldiers, and the historical introduction containing unpublished documents of John Adams. So in this, John Adams explains that more was on the line than the lives of these men, and he wanted to make sure that the British saw these men had the fairest trial they could do, that they could offer, so that it wouldn't ignite the full-out war that they were already seeing coming. And John Adams asked for juries, or the people on the jury, to be non-Bostonians, so that the men would have the fairest trial he could possibly offer. Also, there was another document that was written 2 years after the massacre that kept inciting people to remember. The people of Boston were not happy that the men got away with what they felt was murder, and that 2 of them only had to deal with manslaughter. They felt that the penalty was not enough, and so they kept considering, but they kept saying, please remember this. Remember that these murderers got away. It was an article taken out, and it was a brief history, and it's a good way for students to see how people felt, even 2 years after this, and how the injustice happened, and to see how this carried on into the Revolutionary War. I think it's important for students to see documents written during this time period, to see how not only did people feel, but how our future president saw that it needed to be fair, that even then he was thinking about the fairness and not necessarily on what his personal feelings were, because he wasn't a fan of the British either, but he wanted to make sure that this was not going to start something prematurely. So these documents, I think, would enhance a class. It would show them a deeper meaning of what the future president was thinking about what is fair, what is right, and what is just. And it also gives them a sense of the way that they wrote back then. There was almost a poetry to it, even in their angry musings of postings that they put in newspapers and letters. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm sorry about my voice. I've been sick. And this is what I have for you today. Thank you very much.